Hey Benji.
Hey Yakov, how's it going?
No news is good news.
Did you have a bit of time off over winter?
Yeah. Turn of the year was pretty quiet here. That's good. How about yourself? How you doing?
Yeah, not so bad. Just adding myself to the agenda.
Hey guys.
Hey Rob.
Um, yeah, so I just wanted to go over the issue that Yakov raised and make sure we're all aligned on how we want to do it and document that decision. Um, yeah, do you want to start, Yakov, going through those examples in the that you had in the discussion?
Yeah, sure. So that means I'm gonna try to share a screen. I always forget. I don't know why. Right here it says share screen. Okay, how about that? Is that working?
Yep.
Okay, great. Um, so So this was one example, the first example that I have in this issue, and it's a nested defer. And so this discussion issue follows sort of the it's basically an update or continuation of the issue Benji raised a while back on nested defer. And I guess, Benji, you can tell me if I'm remembering correctly, but I think the thrust of that at that point was about response explosion. Um, but it obviously touches a little bit on what happens exactly when you nest a defer in terms of when delivery is supposed to happen. And so basically, I wanted to continue that discussion now that we have the new response format and make sure that we're aligned, like Rob said, especially because it turned out that Rob and I were basically working with um, different mental models as to like sort of like which option we had picked as what we're striving to hit first, I guess. And I think we've raised this before as sort of an unsettled issue, but as we're trying to get a version, not necessarily the version, but a version of the spec edits in line, and the implementation to match that, we sort of hit on this issue. For example, the implementation has nested defers always being delivered in order. So that means the parent would be, in this case, outer would be delivered before inner. But the spec implementation, without even realizing it that I had been working on, actually didn't do that. So basically, this is an attempt to just address the issue explicitly, and sort of we touched upon it even after the new response format, but to sort of maybe settle on something. So in this first example, we have two fields in two different nested defers. And so they're at the same level. So in terms of we deliver me in the initial response, that initial outer field, most outermost field, me. And then we have these, additional, I guess, scalar fields that could be siblings, meaning in terms of what's possible to deliver, in terms of the response, these could really be delivered independently, meaning outer and inner, and all the fields in outer and all the fields in inner, which is only one in this example. But should we do that? So that's the question. Should inner always be sent after outer? That's seemingly what the designer of this operation had in mind, that there's two fragments. Let's say a component, these fields describe a component, and then this component, the inner component, is meant to be delivered at a even later stage. But if these innermost fields are ready, should we send them, execute them, and send them earlier? So I wrote down what are the possible benefits. So without belaboring it, basically we send actionable payloads only. So what does it mean, actionable? So if these were at different levels, meaning if the defer was at a higher level, and that's actually example B, we sort of have answered this question already, very strongly. In this case, we can't, even if field for outer takes a long time to resolve and to complete, I should say. We don't send a field for inner, even if it's ready first. And the reason it would, is that we have this ordering designed to make sure that we never have destructive mergers, and we have always a simple insert. And so therefore, there's no place in that final reconcilable object that we're building yet to place inner if outer hasn't been sent. So in this situation,
the path would point to a place that doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of actionable, this inner thing is not actionable by the client, by the GraphQL client, even though even if it's ready. So back to the first example, that's not the case here, and that's exactly why we can send inner first. And so in some sense, inner is actionable. But on the other hand, the GraphQL client knows what to do with it, but I guess the client application that's using the GraphQL client, we would assume in most cases doesn't yet know what to do with it, because this defer structure, because even though inner is ready, outer isn't. And so presumably there's there's nothing to do yet with inner until outer is sent, just as like an individual field that was in the outer fragment, like field for outer, it wouldn't make sense to send on its own. A collection of fields, even if they happen to be ready, again, it's similar logic, we wouldn't really need to send them. There's nothing to do with that whole component, inner component, until outer is ready. So the benefit of always preserving the deferred dependencies is in some sense like a consistency question in terms of actionable payloads only. So that's a trade-off, but one consideration. And then I wrote over here more consistent handling with errors, but you'll see that there's a lot of strike throughs over here. And it turned out that I was misunderstanding actually what we had initially what we had initially said. And basically what happens in terms of errors is just that an extension of that. If outer errors, then inner, it's not just that it's sent early, but if outer errors, probably inner there's no reason to send it at all. And this is a nested component, so the whole component errors. And what I mean by erroring, meaning that a null bubbles out so that the whole component is considered non-mergeable. So if that happens to outer, it shouldn't, really the client application is not going to have anything that it can do with inner, because outer is never going to resolve, outer will never be ready. And so this whole component is sort of like in an unstable state, presumably. So that was the point that, not the first point that I made about errors, but the correct point, I guess, that I made about errors, that there's a little bit of unnecessary sending of payload inner if outer errors. Whereas that doesn't happen if the deferred dependency is. So then I just, in the issue, I'm just seeing, and Lee also had mentioned the issue about like defer creep. Like if we allow this nesting of defers, then maybe people will end up referencing fragments that have unnecessary defers, and things will get deferred even when they don't really need to be deferred. And so that may have been more of an issue in the old format, but in theory could still be an issue now. So that was a negative of raising. So those were some of the considerations. This is another example to keep in mind. So this example is slightly different, but pretty similar to example A. What's the difference? We have this initial me field in the initial response. And so because of that, the me in the outer field is actually always shadowed by this me in the initial response. And so therefore it's never truly sent as part of outer. It will always have been already sent. And so this field is essentially, this operation, example C, is essentially similar to C prime over here. And putting aside field for initial, that's essentially similar to example A, in that these two different defers, outer and inner, could always be considered siblings. It's always the case, just looking at this operation, that you could send inner as soon as really independently of outer. But what's interesting about this, or slightly more interesting, is that it's not 100% obvious. You sort of just looking at example C. At example C prime, it's more obvious. At example C, it isn't. And so this idea of when you can send, just another consideration, when you can send inner independently, is not immediately obvious. Like even if you have two different defers at, they don't 100% seem like, they're not nesting each other completely. They occur in different fragments. You could also sometimes be able to send them independently. So the question would be, would we treat example A and example C? So there's not really that many differences in terms of like the plus minuses, meaning in terms of what's actionable. It's not really a difference between example A and example C. It's more in terms of maybe about what Lee mentioned about sort of unintentional defers versus ignore, in that sense. But other than that, they seem to be equivalent. And I guess the only reason I'm belaboring it is because initially in our implementation, actually, we're not treating it the same way. We're treating example C differently right now than example A, and we're always respecting the defer ordering in this case, but not in the example A case. And again, because I guess, what happens when you don't address something head on is that we end up with some inconsistencies. So in conclusion, I guess basically Rob and I were also talking offline, and it seemed to us that example C and example A should be treated the same. It was less clear to us which way to go, but Rob was definitely, if I'm stating this accurately, was leaning more towards just sending things early when possible, and not necessarily maintaining and I think I think you wrote it down, right? And Rob, you can speak to this, but it sounds like what you wrote was that it makes the spec and implementation simpler, and that this is the right way to go in terms of like backwards compatibility. And then the last thing I realized, I'm just going through an order just to make sure I don't list anything, because I don't have it so organized in my head. So I'm just using this. The last consideration that I raised is that is coming back to the early execution discussion, in that by delivering something as soon as it's mergeable into the to the tree, we're executing things early. So earlier than maybe the operation writer intended, even though it's not early in the sense that it's mergeable into the tree, it's earlier than maybe the operation writer intended, and that could lead to that same sort of maybe cascade of horribles as you outlined in the other issue, Benji. So those were sort of the considerations. I would say that I had mostly been convinced by Rob that we should not, by these points over here, that we should not necessarily be so strict on defer order. And now that I realize that it has to do with early execution, I'm not so sure. Now, for example, Facebook, or Meta, I should say, had an outline for us that they do early execution. They didn't say about early delivery, but they do early execution on nested defers and not on the initial defer. And this would be an example, like, well, this would sort of fall under that, in certain situations we'll do.
Just to be clear about that.
Yeah.
I think what they're saying, Facebook, is that what they do is they do one level of defer. Anything after that is not deferred. So it's not really early executed. It's just inlined.
Okay.
I might be wrong on that, but that's my understanding.
Yeah, it's been a while. So I wouldn't trust my memory over yours on that for sure. So I'm not sure. So that's a valid approach, right? If you're not really honoring the defer at all, then I sort of then this issue won't occur. And you won't need to decide what to do about defer ordering. Um, but uh, but I think I in terms of consistency, I feel like I'm not all the issues like fundamentally that plagued early execution would still occur, but then we don't expect there to be too many nested defers. But I kind of don't feel like we should if we have a feature of nested defers. Like I feel like we should make it meaningful. And so and the other issue that I mentioned over here is that we wanted to write the spec in such a way eventually that you could do either really, and you can have a normative note, like we could specify it in either way, and like a simple normative note would suffice, or maybe mention both, like in the spec, depending on really how minimal it is. But here you can't really. Here it turns out that the early execution is simpler to specify what Lee's like original intuition was, and not what I had initially found. And adding like this defer ordering is not it's not super complicated, but it is more complicated, and it doesn't seem to be like a way
Yeah.
to just get rid of it, that complication. So basically, the way I end up is I would suggest that, like Rob, if we take the suggestion of not maintaining the defer ordering and explicitly like relying heavily on number two, that we could always add it later. I would say like that's where I'm heading. That's what I think are the eventual goals should be. I'm not, yeah, and so I like a strong preference on that, but relying heavily on that second point, it seems to me like it's not super critical that the first release have it that way. That's sort of where I come out, but obviously I want to hear more feedback
Yeah,
from you,
I'll
Rob,
jump
and from
in.
Benj.
Um, yeah, I did write this in favor of going with option B, where we do send them early. I'm a little bit less confident about it right now, but basically like the reasoning was that the reason one is more complex than the other is that um can you scroll up to to one of the queries? It's like when you're executing this and you're in collect fields and you're gathering them, you just need to know that if the field is deferred and which defer it's in, and then you can you can send it. Whereas with the other option, you need to like basically keep track of a separate tree of how of the defers instead of relying on like the tree of how the fields are. When you get to collect fields and you're looking underneath me and you see field for outer and field for inner, the algorithm is like somewhat simple where you can just say that they're both deferred and start and like add them to whatever to the defer queue. Um, and you're basically relying on like the collect field algorithm to ensure that like you're starting to do that and it can be inserted because the path is going to be there because you had already executed me above it. Um, if there's more restrictions on how they're sent, you have to track a separate tree of how all the defers are laid out. Um, and all the examples where you're saying whether it's actionable or not, that is assuming that the client is basing each deferred fragment on a component, and the components and the defers are spread in the same order that the components are used, which is probably that's how I would use defer. That's probably how most people will, but it does not necessarily has to be how it's being used. But like I said, I'm not totally sold on either one right now.
Okay.
And I see that I think Benji left another comment.
Yeah. So rather than looking at it from the spec point of view, I look at it from the user's point of view. And to me, it's very clear that we have to do that the innermost thing cannot be delivered until the outer is also delivered. Here's an example. So if you imagine that that first fragment is associated with a component that renders the body of a post and then also gets the highlights from a large language model, which might be just like an array of ranges of things to highlight, right? It's a small amount of data. It's correlated with the body, but it takes a long time to generate because you've got to put it through an LLM. For the person writing that component, they can say, right, give me the body. I can render the body straight away. Then give me the highlights. Once I got the highlights, I can then render those highlights against the body. Great. If we then have that somewhere else in the application, that component itself is deferred, the component itself doesn't know that it's deferred. So it doesn't see its body highlights defer as an inner defer. Very much body highlights comes after body from the point of view of the programmer. So for body to come after body highlights does would be very unexpected. The user wouldn't expect to have to check after body highlights is there that body itself exists. So I think it's absolutely essential that we don't deliver until the data is until it's in the structure that the user would expect.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting that in this case, it would be handled by, like, the client would have to understand that it's possible. And like, if the client, if there's a post details component and like, the client is going to not render the post details component until the other one is there, until post details fragment is delivered. And the body highlights would be, it might come earlier, but the code that does it wouldn't be looking at it yet because the framework or client would know not to render post details until that's ready. And you should be able to do that based on, like, the labels and pending and that stuff.
So it would, if I understood you correctly, and I had to dash off to get the door, so I might not have done. What you're saying is you would need like a more intelligent client that understood this better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
I'm
not
keen
totally
to
sold on
avoid
it.
requiring an intelligence client.
Yeah.
Um, I'm pretty sure that the algorithm that I laid out for execution, like my version of it, handles this in the expected way. So the sorry, in the way that I would expect, which is that the defers introduce new layers.
I you I'm not sure. But I think that one thing to double check there is that it still does that when there's the masking that happens from fields being repeated in inner and outer defers. I think that's where it gets confusing. Where it gets tricky in the implementation.
So what, yeah, my version should work with that as well. I think it does do like what you described earlier. It builds up effectively a tree
Okay.
of like dependencies between the defers. But I haven't looked at it for like a year, so it's a bit hazy.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of convinced to go back to going with this option A just because it ends up being the least confusing. Um,
I think maybe the way I'm thinking about it now is that if the server is not managing this additional tree, then the client is going to have to. So
yeah.
that's sort of like just a shifting of complexity that not as yeah. Um, and if there's a side, this is early execution is always possible, so we don't lose that. It's not, could never be, outlawed by the spec because it's not technically observable. What we would lose in this version is the concept of early delivery when possible. And that may have side benefits, but I'm not so much in favor of early delivery just in this one case. It seems like kind of a maybe we could have a more centric meaning, because like even the initial defer, in theory, if there was some weird situation that you want to do an early delivery, it seems like a more generic solution to that maybe would make more sense. That could be like added on if ever.
Yeah, I think this example has mostly convinced me that it's going to be what's expected by users, and that it's worth the complexity in the spec algorithm.
Okay, and definitely depending on the exact spec algorithm, like in my version, it's I sort of by accident did it the other way, and so you can see that there is some additional complexity. In my version, I mean, eventually we'll have to come around to, Benji has a version up for, like you said, for a year now, so we'll have to, really, and I understand Benji hasn't submitted it because of, some hesitations there, but it's not necessarily clear to me that it adds so much additional complexity. I don't think that was his hesitation. If you correct me if I'm wrong, Benji, right? So
mostly mine is not a complete and audited, tested solution. It hasn't got implementation. It was just like me to help me understand other people's proposals. I just set about writing what I felt I would have done. And like solving those problems for myself to give myself the like understanding. So it exists on a branch, but it was really like, hey, there might be useful bits that you can pull into your solutions from it, rather than here is an alternative way of doing it. But I did try and address and also like understand as many of these issues as possible. So like initially, I think it was me that proposed that maybe these nested defers like this that are effectively siblings, maybe we wanted to flatten those, because that was to do with the response explosion, as you mentioned at the beginning of the call. But that was back before we redid the structure of this. And redoing the structure actually meant that those problems that caused me to want to make these siblings didn't exist anymore, or at least weren't nearly as bad. So now it's actually more reasonable to not do that. But even had we done that, I would have said that they would have to be like, effectively by being siblings, they would be executed together rather than one or the other could execute and deliver first. They would be like grouped, they would collapse, is what I was originally proposing like 2 years back or whenever it was. But we don't need that anymore because the response format has changed.
great. Great. So in terms of this conclusion, we have a PR. Oh, but and I assume then we're all on the same page that A and C should be treated. I mean, I'm pretty sure that we're basically talking about A, that now we should respect the ordering, and C also we should respect. Basically, we always should respect the ordering. I think that's how it turns out in terms of this discussion. So that would be option A. So we do have an implementation PR to fix it, and we already had actually sort of a confused muddle approach where we were respecting ordering in B and C and not A, and now we could do just A also, and then then I have a version of spec edits that I've been looking at, similarly to to help me understand the problem and try to make them as complete as possible. But we have a version of that as well that also does A. So Ooh.
Now, what about the pending pay fields that we send? Can you scroll up to example A?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Whoa. Yeah. Here I don't have the responses. Um,
Yeah. Um,
but yeah.
we should be able to send the pending for inner before outer is completed, right?
Yes. We just, just as we could send the answer, meaning the response for inner before outer, we could, because it's really dependent on me, we could send the pending first. I was assuming that we wouldn't, which I guess why you raise it, but we could.
Yeah, I feel like we should because what if they're both ready together? Like if we I think we would want to be able to send them in the same response payload because otherwise your client is going to have to if we like held it up. So like could this be resolved in two payloads, one with the initial response and one with the two defers? That's the question.
So if you would inline the second of the inner, so maybe it depends on how inlining is
Yeah,
done
without inlining.
without, right. So without
Could we
inlining,
send payload one has me empty object and then a pending with a label for outer and a pending for the label for inner. Then the second
so
response.
yeah, that's really interesting. So in general, for something I noticed, I might want to write it into the chat. Basically, we could, because um, like the ID outer and inner are both going to have IDs, right? And they both are going to have the same path and subpath, right?
Yeah.
No matter what, right? So the thing is, what the pending does is it gives us the ability to issue another ID to the client or make the client aware of some identifier for it. But if you have within the same payload the ability to send the pending, all the incrementals, and the completed at the same time, you could you could do that. It's a little weird the way we labeled pending because pending means sounds like it's not coming now, but we could send it at the same time. Um, but if we just change the name to, let's say, something more palatable, like dependency or something like that, it's a little bit more neutral. But in this particular case, you don't have, for this particular question, you actually don't have to send send the pending or the completed for inner. You could just send the incrementals for inner and as still as separate payloads as if there was a separate inner defer. And you could give the ID and subpath of outer because it's really the same as of inner. I mean, that's a theoretical possibility. I can try to write it down really quickly because I'm not sure um, that makes sense. So I'll try to write it in the chat as quickly as I can.
Yeah, I think I need to think through that some more. Maybe we'll make a separate discussion. Um, but but I do want to make sure that like when it's possible to batch things together into the same response, we are doing that. Because I remember, I think this was in like Kuwait's talk at the conference, like how basically like the most important thing for them was not like sending like not like re-rendering a bunch of times. And if like the server is able to batch them together, then I think we should be able to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think I would prefer just thinking about. Well, I don't know. I think it's, yeah, like you said, worth a better discussion. I'm not sure what I would prefer right now and what all the options are. I just thought of that response on the fly. It's probably going to take me too long to type it. I'll probably make too many typos. But yeah, I think we could raise a separate issue on it. And basically, the question is when do you raise in this situation, like examples A and C prime, when are you allowed to issue the pendings? What I like about Actually,
Yeah.
that's
I
yeah,
wouldn't want it to be that this, even if field for outer and field for inner are resolved by the server at the same time and they're both ready, that we have to send 3 responses
right.
because you
Yeah, that
need the
makes
pending in the second one and then it has to be completed in a third one.
right. That definitely makes sense. What I would say is that it touches on the general well, it touches on a question of when to defer, like what are the different ways you can inline in general. But yeah, meaning even in the yeah, but I want to organize my thoughts better. Yeah, let's start a separate discussion. But I think that's a great starting point as to the goal.
All right, sounds good. Um, Anything else we want to talk about today? Take that as no. Um, all right, yeah. Thanks for joining, everyone. Um, the next meeting I think is the February, whatever the second Monday of February is, the 12th.
Cool. See you
All right,
then.
see you then. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thanks, Benji. Thanks,
Bye.
Rob. Bye.
Bye.